Hello, Guy Benson.
Hello, Conn Carroll. How are you?
I'm doing well. This is Conn Carroll, the senior editorial writer for the Washington Examiner. We're here with Guy Benson of Town Hall for another edition of Pros and Conn. Guy's our pro for this week. We're going to be talking about the Republican primary. Where are you coming to us from today, Guy?
I am in sunny Southern California, believe it or not, which is a nice departure from D.C. this time of year. I was actually tempted to set up a shot with some palm trees in the background just to make everyone a little bit jealous, but I figured, what's the point in that? I can see them better this way anyway.
And why are you in gorgeous Southern California?
So I'm down here, or out here, I suppose, because the Salem Radio Network, which is the parent company of Town Hall, they have the special election night coverage headquarters for Super Tuesday and other big election nights is located out here. So I flew out here and co-anchored 6 hours of coverage on Tuesday night, live coverage with Hugh Hewitt and Ed Morrissey from Hot Air. So that was quite a challenge, but a lot of fun, and of course, much drama on Tuesday night.
Great. Well, let's start there. Do you want to give us your kind of rundown of what happened yesterday that was important? And I'll interrupt you with questions along the way.
Sure. Well, the way I approached looking at the Super Tuesday contests this year is I broke them down into 4 categories. Maybe about a week ago at this point, when I started to really get a sense of where the polls were headed. One thing that was interesting to me, Con, was in 2008, Super Tuesday was a much bigger deal. There were 21 states. There were lots of really big prizes at stake. California, for example, was one of them. This time around, not quite the same punch, right? There was only 10, so less than half. But it was still the busiest and most crowded day on the primary schedule, so it was going to be a big deal. And it became pretty clear that Mitt Romney, so this was Group 1, Mitt Romney was going to win relatively easily in 4 states. And those 4 states were Massachusetts, his home state, neighboring Vermont, Virginia, where it was a 2-man race, my current home state, and also Idaho, where there wasn't really very good polling, but there's a large LDS population, and Mitt Romney was drawing huge crowds when he went to Idaho. So it looked like he was in pretty good shape there. So that was my first group. It was kind of the Romney group. The second group was the not Romney group, where it looked relatively obvious that Newt Gingrich was going to lock down his home state of Georgia, and that Rick Santorum was going to win Oklahoma, where he had been leading by double digits in many polls. Then there were 2 additional caucus states that had virtually no reliable polling whatsoever, North Dakota and Alaska, and you could really just sort of try to guess which way those ones were going to go. In North Dakota, Ron Paul and Mitt Romney and Rick Santorum all campaigned there. Romney won North Dakota in 2008, but that was during a different cycle and a different dynamic when he was the kind of the conservative alternative to what was perceived as a squishy, moderate frontrunner, John McCain. And so the tables, as it turned out, flipped on Mitt Romney in North Dakota this year. And then Alaska, he also won up there in 2008. Ron Paul had gone up there personally to campaign. I believe he was the only candidate to do so. And then the final and 4th group were the toss-up states, both of which were very delegate-rich prizes. Tennessee, which was trending towards Santorum but getting closer based on some of the polling data in the final week. Some polls had even indicated it could be a 3-way race and a virtual tie between or among Santorum, Romney, and Gingrich. And then, of course, the crown jewel, Ohio, which was the only general election swing state that was being contested on Super Tuesday with 66 delegates, and obviously one of, if not the most important state to putting together that 270 electoral vote presidential puzzle in the fall. So those were the 4 groups that I was really tracking throughout the night on Super Tuesday, and we can probably get into this. Those groups actually, I think, stood up pretty well when the actual results started to come in.
Right. So there are only 10 states, like you mentioned, and Romney ended up taking 6. Santorum had 3 and Gingrich 1 was the
Right.
final break. And Santorum
Right.
taking the North Dakota caucus, the Oklahoma, which you said was in his the sure thing column, and then Tennessee.
Although here's what was interesting about Santorum's wins. North Dakota was, I would say, somewhat unexpected. I guess it would be kind of a fair way to put it, but I wouldn't say it was shocking in any way, shape, or form. Oklahoma was expected, as I alluded to, but what was unusual about that one was it ended up only being by 6 points. There were polls that had Rick Santorum up by 18, 20 points in Oklahoma not too long ago. He ended up squeaking it out, at least relative to Tennessee. And Tennessee was the state that was supposed to be a nail-biter for Santorum, where some of his lead was ebbing and some of his momentum may have been reversed, and Mitt Romney in one poll was leading by a point, and Newt Gingrich was tied for first in a PPP poll, and it ended up being a Santorum romp. He won by 9 points. So in that sense, we got that backwards. Oklahoma ended up being closer than Tennessee, which is not something that I certainly anticipated. One common thread in both of those states, evangelical voters, self-identified evangelicals, dominated the Republican electorate in those two states, with Rick Santorum benefiting overwhelmingly from that dynamic. 3 out of every 4 voters who went to the polls in Tennessee and Oklahoma were self-identified evangelicals, and Rick Santorum cleaned up in that demographic.
Yeah, if you look at the exit polls, it really seems as though Romney performed almost identical among both groups in Tennessee and Ohio. There just turned out to be a kind of more upscale, less evangelical demographic in Ohio that put him over the top versus what happened in Tennessee.
That's right. And so it has sort of fed into this, does Romney have a Southern problem narrative that we're starting to hear a little bit. But let's talk about the states that he won. Massachusetts, not a surprise, of course. Massachusetts Republicans have voted for him, I think now, let's think, 5, 6 times, because the primary in his Senate race, the general election in his Senate race, the primary in his gubernatorial race, the general in the gubernatorial race, and then in 2008 when he ran for president, and now again in 2012. So Massachusetts Republicans are used to voting for Mitt Romney. They did it again by a huge margin. I think he won by 60 points over Rick Santorum there. Vermont was closer. Ron Paul performed okay up there, but it was still no drama. They called it pretty early. Virginia was a 60-40 win for Romney, where the only other guy on the ballot was Ron Paul, because Newt Gingrich and Rick Santorum and some of the other candidates who have dropped out failed to qualify for the ballot. And so it kind of became a Romney versus not Romney situation, where Ron Paul was the proxy for not Romney, which I know was problematic for some of my friends who wanted to vote against Romney but really didn't want to vote for Ron Paul. So Romney won 60-40, but I don't think that was quite the gap that people were expecting. Certainly the polls indicated it might be wider than a 20-point spread. And in fact, it was close enough that Ron Paul was able to win one congressional district, meaning that he picked up 3 delegates, which is something that a lot of us were not expecting. And then finally, Idaho was almost a Massachusetts-level blowout for Romney. He won very, very easily. As I said before, Newt Gingrich won Georgia without much drama, although he didn't get to 50%, which is kind of crucial, because that 50% margin could have really helped him with at-large delegates, sweeping all of them, but instead they're going to be proportional because he couldn't quite get 50 plus 1% in his home state. And then there was Ohio, which was the big story of the night, Conn. As I'm sure you remember, a lot of people sweating bullets approaching midnight on the East Coast as Ohio was so close again.
So is this thing over? Has Romney wrapped this up? I mean, what would have to happen in order for someone other than Romney to be the nominee at this point?
Well, okay. 3 questions that you asked. Is this thing over? I think the answer mathematically at this point has to be yes, barring some sort of catastrophic, unforeseen political earthquake. Has Romney wrapped it up? No, that's a little bit more of I guess a little bit more of an esoteric answer you can give, or sort of more philosophical. He hasn't wrapped it up because it's very obvious that there are still lots and lots of Republicans who won't jump on the bandwagon. And I think we'll see, and we'll probably get to this, the upcoming schedule in the next few weeks. It's not necessarily going to be a walk in the park for Mitt Romney through the rest of March. So I think he still has a fair amount to prove to a sizable chunk of the Republican electorate nationwide, but he was beginning to trend well ahead of the national polls before Super Tuesday. I think he won 6 states on Tuesday night. He won a strong majority of the delegates that were up for grabs, that were in play that night, and he's approaching 40% of the total delegates he would need, of the 1,144 delegates he would need to clinch the Republican nomination. And no one else is even close. And so now your third question, what would others have to do to win? It would be an extraordinary effort. ABC News, I know, commissioned, I'm trying to remember, I think Front Loading HQ did it, where they ran the numbers, and this was before Super Tuesday. They ran the numbers, and I think they concluded that Rick Santorum would have to win 50% or more in every remaining state just to get a plurality. He wouldn't even win a majority of the Republican delegates needed to clinch the nomination. So, and that's an absolute best case scenario that is extraordinarily generous in terms of the assumptions that they had built in to that scenario that they built. After Super Tuesday, the hill became much steeper because, as I said just moments ago, Romney really helped himself in terms of delegates, even in states that were close that he lost. He picked up quite a few delegates. In Ohio, where he narrowly won, he took home the lion's share of delegates because of some ballot issue snafus from the Santorum campaign, where he wasn't eligible to win some of the delegates that maybe he would have. So I think I saw Kevin Madden, who is a D.C. guy, he's been a Romney guy for years, tweeting this morning that at this point Rick Santorum, Newt Gingrich has pretty much no chance. Rick Santorum would have to win, I believe he said 64 to 65% of all the remaining delegates to win the nomination outright, and he's averaging in the low 20s so far. So it's a outlandish scenario that, and just a hypothetical that I think has pretty much no chance of coming true. So I think Mitt Romney will be the Republican nominee for president. I think that is clearer than ever, just mathematically. I'm not stating my preference or anything like that. I just think that's what it looks like. But he has not really sealed the deal in the minds of a lot of people in the party, who he is going to need to unite and coalesce around him if he's going to put together a winning coalition in the fall.
Well, let me ask you this then. It seems to me Romney and Santorum have really been trying to shut down the idea of someone new in the race. Romney was asked on CNBC today, if he thought someone else who would win, and he was very specific about the only options being people who are in the race. So would you put? We can talk about Santorum has no shot of getting a plurality, even a majority of delegates. But Santorum doesn't have to do that in order to get to the convention. Paul, Santorum, and Gingrich, the only thing they have to do is prevent Romney to getting to 1144, right. At which point anything could happen at the convention.
Anything could happen. I think that's right. Romney will enter the convention with the most delegates. I think that's very clear. Whether he gets the majority is a little bit hazy at this point, but he certainly could. But you're right. None of these other guys are going to win a majority. Their only prayer is to push it to the convention. But I think the likelihood of a brokered convention or a contested convention is nil. And the idea that someone else is going to get in, I know this has been a favorite media talking point for now weeks. That has driven me completely crazy, because I think there are many, many problems with that whole concept. I think it would infuriate the base in a lot of ways. It'd be essentially the establishment picking a candidate. I think it would be a slap in the face to the millions of voters who have actually voted. Just the Republicans coming in and saying, and swooping in and saying, well, none of those really count. We're just going to start from scratch. And also the people whose names come up in connection to this possibility have over and over again said that they don't want to run, they wouldn't be involved in a brokered convention. So I really think it's an overblown moot point, but I do understand that the media, is just having orgasms over the thought of being able to cover a brokered convention, especially a Republican brokered convention, which would probably help Democrats, frankly.
So speaking of helping Democrats, we've established that Romney's going to be the nominee, but that he's facing an uphill climb for the next couple of weeks, and this is going to go on for a while. Is this elongated primary, is this hurting Mitt Romney? And if so, why and how?
Well, I think that you could make the argument that it is hurting the Republican Party because the longer that Barack Obama has to run around the country making non-campaign spots, non-campaign stops, wink, wink, according to the White House, in swing states, while he's also attending 2 fundraisers for every official event he's at, banking tons and tons of cash, while the Republicans are spending money fighting each other, running around the country as well, but not really focusing on Obama. That's, of course, good news for Democrats, but that's always the case when it comes to an incumbent president and a contested primary on the other side. That's nothing new. I think at some point, if this thing drags on and on, let's say past April into May, and we're getting close to the summer, and it still isn't resolved, and Mitt Romney's clearly got the big lead, but people are hanging on just to do it, I think you'd probably see intensified calls for people to unite and get behind one person. But we're not there yet. And I will say, I know some Romney supporters over the last couple months, Conn, and I'm sure you've encountered this. I know your publication endorsed Mitt Romney. There have been Romney folks who have come out and said, it's going to be Romney. Let's all rally around him now and get this over with. And I think that in some ways, if this had been wrapped up very quickly and easily by Romney, it would have done him a disservice. I think he's really been forced to fight. It hasn't come easy. He's had to develop ground games in a lot more states than I think maybe some of his people were expecting. He's got some really good surrogates that he's been able to attract in some of these states. And he's had to sharpen his debate. He's had to answer questions that he'll answer in a general election about Bain Capital and other things. So I think there definitely is an element of this drawn-out primary that has sharpened Romney, will make him a better, more weathered, and prepared general election candidate. And then the other side of this, Conn, is there's part of me as a conservative that is pleased to see, even if Romney ends up as the nominee, which I would be completely fine with, and I'd be happy to support and vote for him and all that, there is a part of me that is gratified to see that he did not waltz to this thing, that he wasn't coronated early on and nominated by acclamation, and he just sort of was able to sleepwalk through the primary, because I think he's really understanding and internalizing there are a lot of conservatives, Governor, who don't trust you, and part of various elements of your record in Massachusetts and elsewhere have really fed those fears and some of that skepticism, and conservatives aren't really ready to embrace you. And if you're going to have a successful governing coalition as president, where you're going to need conservatives on board, and I think that just being able to dismiss the right will be a little bit harder for a hypothetical President Romney and his administration, or at least that's my hope.
I agree and disagree. I agree in the sense that, anytime a campaign and a candidate have to go out and compete and deliver voters to the polls, that makes them better. So the fact that Romney had to produce a ground game in Michigan makes him better, although I think that state's a lost cause. The fact that he had to do it in Ohio, I think, is great, because that I do think is going to be the battleground state, that in Virginia. The battleground state that will determine this election is Ohio. So the fact that he now has a functioning operation there, I think, is very valuable. The fact that he's going to have to do that in other swing states as we go forward, also valuable. I also think that Romney gets more practice. He had that slip up on CNN after the Florida debate, or after the Florida primary that he won, where he said he didn't care about poor people. That hurts, but I'd much rather have that happen at the end of January than I would have that happen in August or September. Something like that could absolutely kill him. Then he's not going to make that mistake again. So I do think it makes the candidate better.
And to be clear. And to be clear, and I know you don't think this, but he didn't actually say he doesn't care about poor people. He said he very ham-handedly tried to make the point that he wasn't super worried about people at the very lowest income levels because they already have a safety net in place, and he said he wants to protect and repair the safety net. And I know some conservatives had issues with the way he approached that, but you're right. It was a very easily clippable and demagogable clip or video soundbite, especially for a guy who's one of his big problems is people view him as out of touch and rich and that sort of thing. So, and you're right. I think he stepped in it, and he's done that a few times on just sort of tin-eared comments about wealth, and hopefully these sort of trials and tribulations where he's getting beat up for making these mistakes, he's learning from them. I think you're totally right about that.
The only area where I would disagree is I think not because of who Romney is or the weaknesses that have been shown on the campaign trail, but because of who his opponents are, that it is hurting the party generally and making general election for him tougher. I'm thinking specifically about Newt Gingrich and his crazy stuff about moon bases and other comments he's made, but more recently about the birth control debate and Rick Santorum. This is an issue that I do not think would be as prominent if you didn't have the main competitor in the Republican race being a guy who was on record saying that if he were president, he would make a point of, as president, speaking about the evils of birth control. And so I think because of who his opponents are, it has allowed the media to tar him and tar the party as waging a war on women, as famously said.
Look, I think they were going to do that anyway. I think that some of the Santorum stuff and the fact that he's played along has been a problem.
Okay, let me just go ahead. I mean, because you had it was George Stephanopoulos, right, who first brought this up at a debate, and of course later John King did too. Right. But I would argue that they wouldn't have done that had Santorum not been in the race, or even if he had been a lot less prominent. The only reason they were able to do that is because of who Santorum is, because of the statements he's made on the issue. If you didn't, I don't think that's. Okay, go ahead.
I don't think that's totally right. I mean, the war on women talking point. By the way, the media and especially elected Democrats are just lying their rear ends off about a lot of elements of this debate, including this completely false notion that anyone is talking about banning contraception. Senate Democrats are talking about a Republican contraception ban, which is Looney Tunes. No one, not Rick Santorum, who personally opposes the use of birth control, and he said he would talk about it as president, which I think is a totally misplaced priority. But even Rick Santorum said he would do nothing to change the legal status of birth control or anything like that. The impetus for this entire kind of fallacious talking point from the left is the birth control mandate, the assault on religious liberty from the left and from the Obama administration. I think that in some ways this was a trap set by the Obama administration. The fact that they were willing to violate and play around with the First Amendment to do it is extraordinarily cynical. But I think that they knew Republicans were going to push back against this, and I think Democrats were ready to say Republicans are trying to ban birth control. And I think Rick Santorum's views on the issue are just a happy incidental coincidence that makes the demagoguery easier and muddies the waters more. So I would agree with you to the extent that some of Rick Santorum's comments about birth control in the past and even relatively recently as the fall, are particularly unhelpful when it comes to this discussion, but I don't think that they are the cause of it.
Yeah, I think we kind of agree. I just think it allows, I mean, you basically conceded that it gives the media a new opening, and it makes it worse. And I agree with both that. I do think it would be a lot more hermetically sealed from the presidential campaign, from Romney, from the eventual nominee, if Santorum wasn't in the race.
Then that could be. Although I think they were determined. Look, and Rush Limbaugh said what he did, and that has become the latest. Flies to the lamp event or moths to the lamp event, where everyone is freaking out about Rush. And of course, he shouldn't have said what he said. That was bad, and he was right to apologize. So I think that hay was going to be made about this one way or the other. Santorum's presence in the race made it a little bit easier. I also think, Conn, that in a few weeks it's going to blow over, especially if Romney's the nominee. Romney, you talked about that Stephanopoulos debate. It was an ABC News debate in New Hampshire. I was there, and Stephanopoulos was probing this question about birth control bans that would seem totally out of the blue. No one understood where it was coming from, and then I think maybe now we know. And Romney gave a very good answer where he said, finally, Santorum, Stephanopoulos was just relentlessly coming back at him, and Romney finally just sort of aggrieved, said, look, birth control's working just fine. Let's leave it alone. And the crowd laughed and applauded. That's the Republican view of this. I think that this giant hoopla is going to be gone by the heart of the general election campaign. Although I think that the affront to religious liberty is going to stick with a lot of Catholic voters in particular, and I think that's going to be something that any Republican candidate will and should continue to beat the drum about in a general election.
So let's start looking at the general election. As you know, turnout's been down throughout the primaries. Mitt Romney has outperformed his 2008 performance in some states like Florida, but hasn't in others. But more importantly, judging by just the primary results, Republicans look a lot less enthused about 2012 than they were about 2010. Are you worried? Do you think these discouraged GOP voters or lean GOP voters that identify as independents? Do you think they are going to stay home in November, or do you think they are eventually going to turn out for Romney?
I think they'll turn out. Well, first of all, a couple things. Some of the turnout has been down in a number of states. It's also been up elsewhere. It was up in Iowa, Republican turnout, up in Iowa, up in New Hampshire, up in South Carolina, up in Michigan, way up in Washington State, up in Ohio.
4 or 5 of those states you just mentioned are states that have open primaries or open contests where Democrats can go and vote in Iowa, in New Hampshire, and Michigan. And I know specifically in Iowa and New Hampshire that the only reason there are more votes in the Republican primary this time around was because more Democrats participated because they didn't have an Obama or a Hillary to vote for.
Yeah, I mean, I guess you can make that argument, and I know a lot of people have. I just think that, and by the way, the Ohio numbers, and Washington State, I think, was up 4-fold over 2008. I haven't seen all the numbers from Super Tuesday. I know Ohio was up, although I don't know if that's a fair comparison back to 2008 because Ohio was much later in the process and McCain had already wrapped it up. Plus, a lot of Republicans were busy voting in the Democrat primary as part of Operation Chaos. So, I think that Republican voters and Republican-leaning voters are definitely very motivated to win the 2012 presidential election. I think that they are not especially enthused with the field of candidates, and I definitely include myself among them, among the slightly disenchanted or disappointed. But and it has not been.
So wait, let me stop you there.
Sure.
Make this personal for both of us. You mentioned earlier that you're a Virginian, right?
Yeah.
So did you vote yesterday?
Well, I was in California, and so I did not, and I did not get an absentee ballot ahead of time because it was a 2-man race, and Romney was going to win.
Right. I also in Virginia, and for me, voting is really easy. I get off the metro at John Loring. I cross the street. I'm in the front yard of a elementary school, which is my polling station. I go to the back, the playground of the elementary school, and I'm at my house. So literally my backyard is my polling station. And I didn't vote yesterday. for kind of the same reason you didn't. It was a two-man race. I didn't think Ron Paul had a chance to win. I'm not super enthused about Mitt Romney. Santorum and Gingrich weren't on the ballot. But if Santorum and Gingrich were on the ballot, I actually dislike them a lot more. I would have probably shown up to vote for Romney, just to not give it to Santorum or Gingrich. And so I didn't see how far down the turnout was in Virginia, but I'm sure it was anemic compared to the 2008 primaries, which I did, which I did vote in. But there's also zero danger of me not showing up in November for 2012. And I was more worried about the turnout numbers before I actually had to decide whether or not I was going to turn out to vote. And actually having to think about it, do I really want to show up today or not? And at the end of the day, I was like, you know what? The guys I didn't want to run, the guys I wanted to run, the Paul Ryans, the Mitch Daniels, they didn't bother to show up. So I'm not going to show up either. And so I can think of a lot of Republicans, and I didn't really think about it this way until, I had to make the decision. I think maybe a lot of the other Republicans are thinking that way too, is, no one I'm really excited about is going to show up. Why should I show up? But I'm pretty sure that a lot of those people are still going to vote in November.
Yeah, well, first of all, if I had been in Virginia on Tuesday, I would have voted. I voted in the off-year election in 2011.
So did I.
Okay, yeah, so I would have voted, but I did not, as you said, I did not go out of my way to get an absentee ballot and go through that hassle to do it for some of the reasons that you just explained. But in a general election, I'll stand in line for hours to vote against Barack Obama and vote against, Tim Kaine, for example. There's a lot at stake in November, and I know some people are wringing their hands saying, maybe the Republican conservative base won't show up in November because they won't be motivated, because they won't be excited about Mitt Romney. And my only response to that is, if you're not excited to vote, or wrong word, if you are not determined to vote against President Barack Obama to prevent him from securing another 4 years in the Oval Office, I don't really know if you're a conservative, to be perfectly honest. I think all of this nonsense, it's not been a particularly edifying process, this nominating process. The candidates are not very exciting. Some of the names that you just alluded to a few minutes ago there didn't run, but it is what it is. There's no crying over spilt milk. It's going to be a Republican against Barack Obama, and I think that it's going to be a very nasty election cycle. I think the Democrats have nowhere to go but negative. I think that will definitely goose up our base as well. And some of those battle lines will be drawn, the choices will be clarified, and the base will turn out. And it will come down, as always, to independents and swing states and who can win those people.
And speaking of independents, you linked to a John Podhoretz link, which the Romney campaign is actually picking up on today, which is that his weakness among kind of more rural areas and evangelical voters is actually a strength, and that Obama is doing better in the districts and areas and demographics, the more educated, more upper income, more urban areas that are going to be the true swing areas. And
suburban, in suburban areas. I think that's right, and I think, John, to me, it seems like just a specious and bizarre argument to say because Mitt Romney's winning urban and suburban areas, that shouldn't really count in a Republican primary because he's not winning the conservative strongholds. If you believe, like I do, and it sounds like you do, the base and conservatives will turn out to vote against Barack Obama, and the only viable alternative will be Mitt Romney. And he could probably, juice things up a little bit with maybe a vice presidential pick that gets conservatives a little bit more excited or whatever. What you need to do is keep your base, hold the base and have them turn out, and then you need to win independents and try to keep the margin of loss down in places like Cuyahoga County, Ohio, for example. Where Romney, which put Romney over the top last night. So I think if you look at it from that perspective, it makes perfect sense. And I think to some extent it's really grasping at straws for these Romney opponents to say these wins, are somehow tainted or shouldn't count as much because it's these Democrat or swing areas that he's winning rather than the base.
Yeah,
I know there are some people, Conn, who disagree with me, who think that no conservatives won't turn out for Mitt Romney. Okay, we'll see, but I find that very hard to believe.
No, I agree. The conservatives are going to turn out without a doubt, and I think it's Romney's a better candidate, for a better general election candidate, for being able to turn out the more urban, suburban areas with higher educated, kind of more upper income voters. I'm actually in Michael Barone's office, and he's berating me that's his line. It is. He's made that point. I did. He's made it a number of times on our Washington Examiner site.
You should tell him that that imitation is the sincerest form of flattery.
I will. You already kind of broached the subject, so I'll go there. What are the fantasy list vice presidential names that you think would seal the deal with the conservatives and really get them out there to the polls like they were in 2010?
Well, that's a good question. Of course, there are the names that everyone always talks about. Marco Rubio being at the very top of the list. You hear the name Chris Christie thrown out there. I don't think it'll be Christie at all. Rubio makes sense on a number of fronts. I do wonder if it will really be him, though. I think he would really excite a lot of people and would be extremely helpful in it. And if you're of the school of thought, like I think a lot of us are, that this is really a must-win election, you do whatever it takes to win. And if that means burning Marco Rubio's red shirt, so to speak, to use a sports analogy, you do it. But I know there are some people who aren't totally convinced of that. I think Virginia Governor Bob McDonnell is someone that is getting some attention and probably should. I know he's not Mr. Excitement, but he's a very competent chief executive, conservative, has pretty good conservative bona fides, and he's an evangelical Christian, which may, mitigate some of the concern among some folks in the South in particular, being a Southern governor. I think Mitt Romney has said he would like a chief executive. That would be his ideal pick. It would be sort of like, two competent chief executive governors against two windbag senators. Rob Portman is a name that you hear sometimes, especially if Ohio is going to be so important. I know the Romney people are crediting him with an enormous amount of work on the ground in his home state of Ohio. I also don't think that he's necessarily a grab you by your collar excitement guy. But some of this could be strategic. I don't know. Those are a couple of the names. What else are you hearing?
Well, I just wanted to note, there's one big name I didn't hear you mention at all, Paul Ryan.
Yeah, Paul Ryan is a guy that you've definitely heard occasionally in connection to these conversations.
But you sound like you're against it.
Well, here's why. I love Paul Ryan. I love Paul Ryan. I think Paul Ryan would be wasting his time as the Vice President of the United States. I think Paul Ryan, front and center as the chairman of the Budget Committee in the House, is fighting the fights that are desperately needed to be won. And I think that he's in a position really to make an impact. Whereas I almost feel like he would be wasted in the vice presidency, considering the moment that we're in. But if Mitt Romney, for example, if he wins the nomination, which for reasons that we talked about half an hour ago, I think he will now. If he picks Paul Ryan, I can't lie and tell you that a part of me would not be just thrilled. But I would also worry about, let's say Romney loses, do you then attach the loser label to a guy like Paul Ryan or Marco Rubio? And if he wins, is Paul Ryan sitting there in the Naval Observatory twiddling his thumbs, unable to really craft the policy and advance it in Congress that needs to happen to get this economic and debt crisis under control.
Sure. Let me make the pro Ryan case.
Do it.
Okay.
I want to be convinced, actually.
Well, as vice president, he could hang out in the Senate all day, as is his constitutional role to do so, pushing for his agenda. He also has, all the relationships in the House and knows how to get stuff moved through the Budget Committee to help shepherd that along, which Obama did not have with Obamacare. And more importantly, I know Democrats are already trying as hard as they can to tie Mitt Romney to the Ryan budget. But I want them to really be able to do that. I want Romney to be really committed to it. And putting Ryan on the ticket does that. It really puts entitlement reform front and center in a way that no other choice does. And I think Ryan has been the strongest, most articulate, most consistent voice for a new free market direction for the country. And I think he would improve Romney's rhetoric. I think he would improve the principled stance he takes. I think he'd just make him a better general election candidate.
Can I ask you a question?
Sure.
And I don't have a predetermined opinion on this. I wonder, you always want the vice president to be able to go out there, the vice presidential candidate to go out there and be the attack dog. Mm-hmm. I feel like Paul Ryan, one of his greatest strengths and assets is that he's a winsome, cheerful, earnest guy who's very wonky. I wonder if he would have it in him to really play the political attack dog, and if that would also sort of sully his brand or be sort of a fish out of water role for him.
I think Ryan's best moments has been when he stood up to the president directly in his presence and, I don't know if attacked is the right word, but challenged him effectively. Reagan also.
The healthcare summit. You're right. The healthcare summit was if you remember, at the Blair House.
Right.
Paul Ryan went directly at him.
Right. Not just the healthcare summit, at the GOP retreat later. Ryan had some good, tough questions on him. He's been in the same room with him and performed well. I just think Ryan has performed that. And if you look at like Ronald Reagan, no one really thinks of him as an attack dog. They always think of him as the sunny, cheerful guy. But a lot of that is masked by the fact that Reagan did know how to deliver some really stunning, hurtful attacks. Not hurtful, but effective attacks is what I meant to say. He was great at undercutting his opponents. He just managed to do it in a funny, effective, optimistic way. And I think Ryan isn't the talent that Reagan is, but I think he has that same style. And I think he could develop that in a VP role.
All right. Look, I have my concerns that I've aired. If somehow this were to happen, I can't say I would be too disappointed. I'm just a huge card-carrying member of the fan club. So I think we're on the same page there.
Sounds good. We're coming up on 45 minutes. Is there any last subject you want to talk about before we leave?
Yeah. Just looking ahead for the primary schedule, I know some people are probably going to be all bent out of shape that I've said Romney's going to win this, and it's something I've really held off on saying until now, where I'm just looking at the math and I'm increasingly convinced. I think for the rest of March, starting next week and beyond, it's actually going to be pretty favorable terrain for the not Romney candidates, and I'm sure some people will, flaunt this stuff and say, oh, you called this over. Oh, I'm expecting it to be probably a pretty rough rest of the month for Romney.
Starting Saturday in Kansas.
Kansas is definitely Santorum territory. Alabama, Mississippi, the Gingrich campaign's putting money down there and advertising, and that's where Newt's going to be for the next week or so. So I think it's going to be a tough go for Romney, with some exceptions in maybe Hawaii and probably Illinois, by the way, where there's more delegate access problems for Rick Santorum. Then the calendar flips to April, which becomes almost the exact opposite. Virtually every state in April much more favorable to Mitt Romney, with the big glaring caveat that one of the states is Pennsylvania, which should be obviously Rick Santorum's to win. But it gets a lot better in April. And the other thing is, after April 1st, you start to see a few more states that have winner-take-all systems for these delegates. Places like New Jersey, where Chris Christie, of course, is a big surrogate and endorser. Places like Utah, where Mitt Romney, of course, is going to do very well for obvious reasons. So I think that we'll see some tough sledding over the next month, where there'll be split decisions and mixed verdicts. And then I think April is going to be probably a juggernaut month for Romney.
I agree. I think, hopefully Foster Freeze and Adelson will talk some sense into their boys come the end of April.
But last question for you, Conn.
Sure.
And I mused about this on Twitter last night. This is my one concern. We have the Guam caucuses and primary coming up.
Uh-oh.
And I am just concerned if too many Republicans show up at a single polling place, is the island liable to tip over and capsize?
Wasn't there a congressman who mused about that problem?
One of the greatest instant classic YouTube clips of all time.
That was a good one. I don't know. We'll find out this weekend. I'm sure it'll be a headline on CNN if it does happen.
I'll be keeping an eye on it.
Okay. Thanks you so much, Guy.
Hey, thanks for having me, Conn. This was fun.